Gail Walker, who is the Executive Director of IFCO Pastors for Peace. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a wonderful conversation I've been listening to, and important information that you're sharing, but grateful to be here.
No, we're very grateful for you to joining us. And, Gail, you were just recently in Cuba, and maybe give us some context of the impact of the blockade, because I think that's really the important thing that so many people, at least here in the United States, don't hear about in terms of the material situation in Cuba.
Yeah, thank you. It was the first time I'd been in Cuba in over a year and a half. Normally we go down quite often. We organize delegations and an annual caravan. We also facilitate the opportunity for young people to study medicine in Cuba. Another thing that you never hear about, this wonderful gift under full scholarship, with the only understanding being that they'll come back and serve in underserved communities here in the United States. So that's a whole nother show and a whole nother conversation. But I go down quite often, hadn't been down in more than a year and a half. And it was really heartbreaking to see a lot of what we witnessed. There are a lot of difficulties that our Cuban friends and family are enduring right now. Long lines, waiting to get into stores, often getting into stores, and many of the goods that were on the shelves are not there. There's a lot of, like I said, difficulty that the people are facing. But I think that, a big part of that, I know, is very much related to U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy, specifically the 62-year-old blockade. But in terms of, real on the ground impact, it's tragic. It's you've got a lack of medicines. I mean, we brought suitcases and suitcases full of medicines. I'm talking about over-the-counter supplies, aspirins, antibiotics. We know that the suitcases we brought can't in any way supply all of Cuba's needs, and that wasn't the intent. But it was, let's do what we can to bring with us, some help. Gone in minutes. People were, hungering for any of these kind of supplies because there simply are none. I tell the story of a doctor, a friend of ours, who's a surgeon, who said, we can't perform surgery right now because we don't have the, for my patients, I don't have the antibiotics or the pain relievers to prescribe. So it's really disheartening. It's difficult for folk on the ground on a real level, but we really have to look at the sources of the challenges that people are facing, and so much is that it really lays at the feet of U.S. Foreign policy in Cuba.
Well, I'm so glad that you laid this out, and I also just want to give a quick shout out to Leah Boggs, who made a donation there in the chat and just said thank you. Well, thank you, Leah, for watching. And Gail, I mean, IFCO and Pastors, you all have been taking just many different things for so many years there to Cuba, and I don't know how do you make these kind of comparisons, but I mean, it feels like there's almost no country on earth where there's such difficulty performing even the most basic types of trade and economic intercourse around the world.
Oh, so true. That's absolutely so true. The world, right, has been grappling with this pandemic, no doubt. It's been a very difficult time for many nations in the world. But imagine being really the only country in the world that is trying to handle the pandemic, provide support for its people, while the U.S. government has been imposing a draconian, the list of adjectives, right? Illegal, immoral, unjust blockade against this tiny, small island nation, making it difficult for Cuba to be able to trade, making it difficult for it to be able to survive. There's no doubt that the challenges that Cuba has been forced to endure are contributing to a very difficult situation. You've got the blockade, coupled with the lack of tourism, the lack of people that are actually bringing hard currency into the country, which is down as a result of the blockade, but also as a result of the pandemic, and then of course the pandemic. It's a very difficult situation, and there are some bad agents. They're bad. There are some haters in the crowd. There's no doubt that there are people that are getting into some of those stores, hoarding some of those materials, and making it even a bad situation even worse. And the fact that there are entities within the United States that are helping to fan those flames. USAID, which is offering up to $500,000 to individuals and organizations that are willing to, quote, bring democracy to Cuba. There's a lot of there's so many different things at play, I think, on the ground, and it's a perfect storm for unrest and just difficulty for the Cuban people. I just want to also say, when you see a president walk into a crowd, I mean, this is not the sign of a country that is that's on the brink. This is not the sign of a government that is not in touch with its people. So you've got President Miguel Diaz-Canel and his ministers that are in the streets talking to people, right. Really listening, hearing the frustration, but also calling for to be a sane policy toward Cuba and understanding of what is truly going on. So it's I think that was really important and heartening to see. And I think that what Cuba needs now more than ever is for its friends and for the global community to really be able to look and see with a critical eye what's going on in the country, and to understand that there are so many levels of challenges that Cuba has been forced to endure and is grappling with, which is helping to lead to this really terrible situation for the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, Ronnie. Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to remind our listeners and viewers that to what Gail's saying is that under the Trump administration, as the pandemic was starting, Trump added over 200 new sanctions on Cuba, on top of what we already were doing to Cuba. And Biden has come into office and he has maintained those new sanctions on Cuba, despite the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And he literally, with a pen, all he has to do is sign a piece of paper and he can get rid of those sanctions. And he has not done that for one reason and one reason only, and that is the Democratic Party's obsession with courting Cuban exiles in Florida for the sake of winning Florida, which they're not going to do anymore because they'll never outright wing the right wing in America or the Republicans in America. But the point is to say that this is a political game, and it's really duplicitous what's taking place here, because all of the suffering that Gail, that you just described, is a direct result of this blockade. And it's not just on Cuba. I mean, I feel like the Cuba model, because Americans are so war weary after Afghanistan, after Iraq, the Cuba blockade model is America's primary form of warfare now. They're doing it to Iran. They're doing it to Syria. They're starting to do it to Lebanon. They're doing it to Venezuela. And just hearing you speak about medicines, having people going to Cuba and bringing medication with them and bringing money with them is exactly what all my relatives who are coming to Lebanon and Syria are doing. They're having to fill their suitcases with medications because people can't access them anymore. And I just want to point out to what you were saying, one thing that Trump did do at the start of the pandemic is he restricted the dollar amount for remittances. Cuba is a country that, like a lot of developing countries, is very dependent on remittances from people living outside to send money back to their families. It's a part of the economy. And that was restricted to, I believe, $1,000 every quarter somebody could send, which is very little. So that has starved the country of hard currency as well. I mean, it's just so outrageous what you're describing. And I'm curious, when you were mentioning some like, I guess, saboteur elements. When you're on the ground in Cuba, like in America, it's depicted as this like repressive hellhole where people can't speak out. Are people able to have conversations and debate in Cuba? Can you kind of put that issue to rest? I imagine they are, from what I hear. They're able to have conversations about these things quite openly.
Yes, sure. No, that is so often a part of the, the blatant misinformation campaign, right? That there are there's the inability for people to speak their minds. You're going to hear different things, perhaps from different people. I can tell you, my 30 years of having traveled back and forth to Cuba, I've spoken to Cubans who may have a different point of view or a different, perspective on what the government might be doing, who have spoken freely to me. And I've not heard any cases of those people being, imprisoned or in any way, punished for speaking their minds. That's been my experience. I think that the other reality is that, for example, we, the IFCO Pastors for Peace, we're a faith-based organization, inter-religious foundation for community organization. We've done this work in part to really reach out to some of our faith leaders and faith partners in Cuba. The claim that there is no religious freedom in Cuba is absolutely a lie. It's absolutely not true. There are people that worship. There are people that participate in Afro-Cuban religious ceremonies. So across the border, across the gamut, there are expressions of religious freedom. That's a big part of the blatant misinformation campaign and why we do the work that we do, bringing people there to see and experience the reality for themselves. The other thing that you mentioned so rightfully is that, Trump imposed so many restrictions, but Biden, despite the fact that, while he was running for president, said he was going to do all kinds of wonderful things for the Cuban people and hasn't done one thing, hasn't changed anything, has not reversed any of those 243 measures that were implemented by the Biden administration. And the point of remittances is so critically correct. And not just in Cuba, as you mentioned, in various countries, across the globe. But in 2019, $1.5 billion was sent in remittances to Cuba.
Wow.
That's a huge amount of money, and that's gone, and that's not been repaired or changed under the Biden administration. And for Biden to stand up and say, I stand with the Cuban people. If you stand with the Cuban people, then lift the blockade. At a minimum, do what Obama did in easing, because Obama didn't undo the blockade, but he eased some of the restrictions. At a minimum, that is certainly something that Biden can do. So there are so many levels of hypocrisy that are at play, and just indicative of the really the duplicitous, nature of U.S. foreign policy as it relates to Cuba, and not just Cuba, as you mentioned, so many other nations in the world. A big part of what's happening with the attack on Cuba is Cuba's steadfast support for Palestine, for Venezuela, for Nicaragua, for Colombia. It's collective punishment. And that's been the mantra, I think, since the beginning of Cuba's triumph of its revolution in 1959. How dare this nation of Black and brown, people say, we've got our own system, we've got our own way of doing things, and embracing that and holding on to that. And it's earned them the wrath of the U.S. government for too many years. So
well, you make such a good point
it's an
there.
ongoing situation.
No, you make such a good point there. No, please. about what Biden said, and I think that President Diaz-Canel made the same point. Lift the blockade and see what happens. I mean, if they're as terrible as you say they are, then that right there would completely expose them. And we always hear this from the United States. We hear it from, probably some of the people in the comments right now. I don't have YouTube up. Oh, well, that's just an excuse, and it's this, that, and the third. Well, then end it. Then prove all of us wrong that the blockade doesn't do anything at all. And I think the fact that they don't says really ultimately everything about them. But sorry, Rania, I think I cut you off there.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, the numbers don't lie. All you have to do is look at the number of child mortality, hunger, literacy rates, pre-revolution and post-revolution, the access to healthcare, access to education. These things changed dramatically for the better in Cuba. And that is another reason why Cuba has been punished for the last 60 years. Because not only did Cubans themselves free themselves from U.S. empire, U.S. imperialism, U.S. capital, right? Not only did they free themselves essentially from slavery, they also implemented a system of socialism that worked for the masses of people for the better and demonstrated an alternative for the region that could help the majority of people. And that's why there had to be a blockade imposed. A blockade needed to be imposed to show socialism doesn't work. And what's amazing is the resiliency of the Cuban system. Obviously, we talk a lot about the suffering. There is a lot of suffering as a result of the blockade. But I'm also very impressed with the number of people who came out in the street to show their support for the revolution, and way larger protests than we saw from even the protesters in Miami, the Cuban exiles who are still angry that their plantations and factories and land were redistributed and taken away from them, that they lost all their slaves and they want their slaves back. So now they're living in Miami waiting to get their slaves back. That's essentially what those people are angry about. And that's what I think Cuba represents for the developing world, which is such a threat to America, is it represents an alternative system of independence and sovereignty that has managed to adapt itself over and over collectively with a democratic process attached to it for the last 60 years in order not just to survive the U.S. blockade, but to thrive. I mean, as all these shortages are happening, Cuba's still sending doctors around the world. They still have the world's, I think, highest per capita rate of doctors to people in their country. It's incredible. The number of hospitals, the number of doctors. I mean, America, what does America send around the world? America sends its military around the world to bomb countries. Right. Whereas Cuba's sending medical personnel around the world, and America calls that propagandistic and says that the doctors are slaves because apparently Cuban doctors who go and help other countries
I think we have Gloria La Riva with us, who is actually on her way to Latin America right now. I appreciate her joining us en route. Gloria La Riva, the coordinator of the Cuba-Venezuela Solidarity Committee, also was just recently in Cuba. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me. Good to see you all. Hi, Gail. Hi, Rania.
Hi there. Hi, Gloria.
Hello.
I've actually got we're not going to do it yet. I've got a little treat later on. But Gloria, one of the things that Rania was just mentioning, I don't know if you were able to hear her, was the number of people who have come out into the street in support of the revolution, which of course has not been shown here in the mainstream media. But I think that's really an important element of everything that we are seeing right now, is that we're only being shown one side, but that the support for the revolution is certainly there, and it's certainly strong, at least from what I can see.
Yes, I think it's important to have a perspective about Cuban society. When you have millions march literally on May Day, every May Day, except for the pandemic time, people who joyously celebrate being workers. And when you have people in the streets protesting any given U.S. policy that affects them, versus what I would say a number of hundreds, maybe 1,000 people that were demonstrating the other day upon a coordinated action that was obviously planned for months with a very intended objective to create chaos, violence, and to portray Cuba as ungovernable. And therefore, I think that not only that, but the message that the right wing was conveying was that they're suffering Well, 11 million people have been going through this crisis of the pandemic, even though it was well managed, and unfortunately in the last month has, you know, grown very greatly, the numbers of COVID cases. But before that, Cuba was directing everything toward treating everybody, not only who's a patient who is ill, but people who are suspected of being positive, who've been in contact with people who've resulted positive. So all that energy is going toward that. And so I think that the US has, and the other European media and right-wing Latin American media, has been focused over and over on this minuscule number of people. And right now, the pictures you're showing are the masses who came out. The other thing is that the right wing had the advantage by springing this on people on a Sunday afternoon, or Sunday morning, actually. They sprung it, and so they had the advantage of initiative. And now people are showing, you're not going to bring our country down with this kind of operation.
Well, you know, you raise a really important point there, Gloria, in terms of when you said 11 million people have been affected. I mean, I think that in and of itself is an important thing because, as you know, as we all know, you know, there are many countries. We look at, say, a country like Haiti or whatever, where people are doing without, but if you're rich, you can get whatever you want. And it seems like an important statement that whatever exists in Cuba, whether it be good or bad, there's a level of equality there in terms of the experience people have, which seems totally unique, really, certainly in the region, but in many ways in the world.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, in the months before things were getting more difficult with COVID, on January 1st, the country initiated a whole new series of economic measures that, for one thing, raised considerably the wages of all state workers, who have been the ones who sacrificed the most in these last years. The private sector, people have been able to do well until the pandemic. The pandemic has affected everyone economically, but the state workers, the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, the administrative workers in all the offices, so many, I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of people, they've had very low wages, including the media workers, reporters, all the Cuban media. And in recognition of their sacrifice, and staying in those jobs instead of moving to tourism or other things that can gain more income, but to provide the things that people need, education, healthcare, their salaries were boosted considerably. And that's the effect of a planned economy that Cuba has. I was speaking lately about the fact that one of the big problems for Cuba in this blockade is that their currency is not convertible on the world market. So they have to have dollars and euros, mainly through sales of some of their exports, but mainly tourism, or their doctors who serve abroad. The wealthier countries like Italy and others who have needed them badly in Latin America, the ones who have more money, they pay for the Cubans to provide the services for COVID or other illnesses. And then the doctors keep 25% of that money, which is a very good income for them. And the rest of the money, 75%, is spent on Cuba's healthcare for medicine and other things for the people. So the U.S. has been targeting the doctors. You know, they've been demonizing them, saying they're slaves, they're military. The U.S. government says that the 23,000 doctors in Venezuela are intelligence officials. Are you kidding me? But what they've done is to demonize the doctors. And Bolsonaro, this dictator in Brazil, he expelled all the Cuban doctors. And Cuba lost hundreds of millions of dollars in income for their health care. That's why the doctors are being demonized, because their world-renowned healthcare system is a model, is an example.
I think that's such a good point. You know, many years ago, early 2000s, I once got very sick in Venezuela and was treated by Cuban doctors. So if they're not doctors, they're the best non-doctors I've ever been treated by. I'll tell you that. I don't know, Juan in the booth, if we have the photo ready that I was able to obtain this morning, but I think it's you know, it certainly speaks to the testament of the guests and the work that they've done over the years, but also the criminalization. So there's Gail Walker, Gloria La Riva. I mean, this is an amazing story. I actually got this photo. I did not tell Gloria I was going to use this today, but I did get it from her. And it was during I know, Gail, I told you I had a treat. I had a surprise.
That was
Gloria, tell the story of that photo that Gail, I also want to hear from you. It's an amazing story.
Well, it was the summer of 1993 when Cuba went through the worst, the hardest time. You know, the Soviet Union had collapsed. They were on their own. They were trying to make do. And Gail's father, Reverend Lucius Walker, was heading up the second caravan to Cuba, which was a challenge to U.S. policy. They wouldn't accept license. And we were both with about 100 people on that caravan. We get to the border of Laredo, Texas. We spent all day in 107-degree heat, transporting the goods by hand across the border into Mexico. It would be boarded onto a ship, and then we would fly to Cuba. But at the end of the day, the U.S. government seized a little yellow school bus that was headed to Cuba from us. And what ended up being was 7 people went on a hunger strike for 23 days on that bus, including Reverend Lucius Walker. And myself, Gail, and others in the caravan, we flew to Cuba the day that the hunger strike began because the Cubans wanted us there. And we came back after a week, or 10 days. There was no media coverage in the U.S. about it, so we decided we would go to Houston, Texas, and get arrested and make a scene. So we leafleted all day, and then we sat in front of the federal building to say, lift the blockade, end this genocide. And we were arrested. And we thought we'd get out that night, but we were held for 3 days. We were held for 3 days, and you got to take that story over, Gail.
Yeah, it was quite an experience. Yes, we did expect that we would go. I mean, you know, I'm used to doing CD, civil disobedience in New York. We have an action, and then we get what we call a desk appearance ticket, and we come back and we go to court. They held us, as Gloria said, for 3 days and under terrible conditions. I mean, it was hot as hell outside, and the air conditioning was ratcheted all the way up. They were depriving us of sleep. They would just walking from, you know, one part of the jail to another part. They would use that as a pretext for saying, well, we've got to do a strip search, just trying to really break us down, you know, just try to break down our spirit. It was quite an experience. I'd never seen anything like that, experienced that in the U.S. of A, good old, you know,
freedom and democracy, allegedly.
Thank you. Freedom and thank you in democracy. But quite an experience. And it was an honor to be arrested with my sister, Gloria La Riva, who taught me so much. But we've been continuing, had been doing the work before that, but continue to really stand up and support Cuba. You know, the horrible experience we had was certainly horrific, but nothing in comparison to the 6 decades plus of embargo, a blockade, of unilateral, you know, international pointed blockade against the Cuban people. So it's important that we continue to do this work. That's a great picture, though. I got to get a copy.
Yeah, Gail, I walked into the office last night, and some of our people were looking over the photos. It was right on the table. I said, "Oh my God, we just talked about that." But you know, that the 1990s was not only an enormous test for the Cuban people, but their biotechnology was being developed right at that moment, and the tourism was starting to grow. So Cuba rose out of these dire circumstances with their creativity, with the coordination of all the scientists and the doctors. They had, you know, free of the profit motive. That's why they've been able to succeed, because their motive for healthcare is not the profit. Their motive for medicine and vaccines isn't, you know, the stock market. Whenever a medicine goes on the market here, the immediate news is the stock market and what value it has. And there they have the value is a human life. There's a very famous billboard above the Calixto Garcia Hospital, which is a teaching hospital of the University of Havana. It's a picture of Che Guevara, and it says, the life of a human being is worth more than all the wealth in the world.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it speaks to why Cuba has been able to, even with the foot of the blockade, the foot of the U.S. government on its neck, been able to make the commitment to come up with 5 vaccine candidates. It's a tremendous, testament to Cuba's commitment to its people, to healthcare, not only for the people of Cuba, but the people of the region. Many of these other companies, Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson, I mean, they're all looking at, the dollar bill. Cuba has committed to sharing their vaccines with the region, with poorer nations. And it's just an example of what Cuba has done and will continue to do. And it relates to what I was explaining earlier, their commitment to ELAM, the Latin America School of Medicine, teaching, providing an opportunity for young people from various countries, including the U.S., the very country that's been blockading it, an opportunity to bring young physicians to practice where they're needed most in underserved communities in their countries. So it's a
really
wonderful
is
example.
It is. I saw the health minister of
I'd like to
Argentina
say-
give a press conference speaking of that, because, she came back and they said, oh, well, what did you see there? And she said, we examined all of the vaccine from the testing to the production, and it's top notch. I mean, this is, and of course, Argentina is, looking to procure a number of these Cuban vaccines. And I thought, that in and of itself is a testament. I mean, not that Argentina doesn't have a relatively progressive government, but, as one of the wealthier countries in Latin America, one that isn't as demonized, for the health minister of a country like that to make this comment, I think is so important. But Gloria, go ahead.
Oh, no, I want to say that I was in Cuba at the same time Gail was. In fact, we were in the same house. And I have to tell you, day and night, she and her colleague in Pastors for Peace, they were working so intensely with the U.S. medical students to help them, because they've been a year and a half without their families, and they came to provide sustenance and, guidance. And I just have to say it's an extremely important project. And all those doctors who come back to the U.S., it's a lifelong commitment to help the people, the poor, the poorest people who have poor health access, but who Cuba has reached out to the United States as a true act of solidarity. So I really salute Gail and what she's been doing all these years.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you.
Well, one important piece of news that I just was sent that I want to speak, because when we're talking about the work of solidarity activists, I think it's important. And it seems, we don't know this, but the White House may have been affected by the outcry. There's breaking news coming from Reuters that the Biden administration may ease the ban on remittances as part of a review here. Someone just sent me this. I haven't read this fully, but it does speak to the fact that people speaking out, Gail, can work. It does make a difference. It's not just crying into the wilderness.
Yeah, no, that's so heartening. I hadn't heard that news, but thank you. But there's a young man by the name of Carlos Lasso, who's a Cuban American, but anyway, he's literally walking from Florida to Washington, D.C. to highlight the injustice of the blockade, to talk about the fact that, families are being denied the remittances and the support. And I think so much of this, the credit, goes to him as well, not just to him, but those who have put themselves on the line, and to say, these are our families that we're talking about. I'm not terribly surprised that Biden has done. I think it's great and it's wonderful. Will be a benefit to the people who will receive those remittances. But we need more. We need more, and Cuba needs more. But this is good news. This is certainly good news.
Mm-hmm.
It's excellent news. However, I mean, it's important to understand what Cuba's up against, because you have these weaponized immigrants that I've mentioned a few times throughout this episode. Some of them are commenting in the chat and trying to cause problems. Again, still very angry that Fidel took their plantations and their families' plantations. But there's a large, right, this Cuban exile community in Miami, including one of whom is the mayor of Miami. And they're having this crazy debate trying to use these protests from Sunday as a pretext for airstrikes. We have the mayor of Miami went on Fox News and called for airstrikes on Cuba. Can we play that clip? Because it's so shocking. I want people to see it in case they didn't.
A repressive government
I'd love to
and
get
a cruel U.S. embargo. They deserve policies that empower them and help them improve their lives. Do you think that President Biden, looking at this situation, will lift that embargo? And do you think that's what he should do?
No, I don't think the embargo is cruel at all. And I think that the Cuban people are not asking for a lifting of the embargo. They're going out in the streets every single day talking about the failure of the communist regime to provide for its people. And I don't understand why that's so difficult for people to understand. It has failed for 6 decades. And what should be being contemplated right now is a coalition a potential military action in Cuba, similar to what has happened in both administrations, in both Republican and Democrat administrations. In Republican with Bush in Panama, they deposed Noriega, and that country had peaceful democracy for decades. And you had interventions by Democratic presidents, taking out Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. It's a sovereign country where they took out a terrorist that probably saved thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, and President Clinton in Kosovo intervening in a humanitarian issue with airstrikes. So there have been many, many opportunities in the history.
Are you suggesting airstrikes in Cuba?
What I'm suggesting is that option is one that has to be explored and cannot be just simply discarded as an option that is not on the table. And there's a variety of ways the military can do it, but that's something that needs to be discussed and needs to be looked at as a potential option, in addition to a variety of other options that can be discussed.
Yeah. I mean, that is insane. He just called for bombing Cuba to help Cubans. I'd love to get your reaction. Maybe let's start with you, Gloria, and then we can see what Gail has to say.
He's playing to the billion-dollar industry of Miami that gives money.
Miami is it's really functioned, or Florida in general has really functioned as this safe haven that the U.S. has created for far right fascistic terrorists. Honestly, I don't know what else to call them. People who've shot down, been trained by the CIA, and then shot down Cuban airliners, have blown up hotels in Cuba to try to destroy the tourism industry. We even see now, I mean, not to change the subject completely, but just that, we saw today that some of these Colombians who participated in the assassination in Haiti of Jovenel Moïse were actually trained by the U.S. as well, and in Florida. So anyways, just to speak to what you're saying, this is Miami, right? It's not everybody there, of course, not every Cuban there is right wing, but it is this place where all these exiles have gathered and have been weaponized by the U.S. to try to destroy their home countries.
But it's very important to say this. They're not the tail that wags the dog. It's U.S. policy. It's the Pentagon. It's the corporate heads in Wall Street. It's, the White House. They're the ones who direct U.S. policy. The right wing in Miami is their pretext. It's their voice to be able to do what they want to do. And it's not just Republicans, it's Democrats too. Forgive me, but I'm going to have to get off. I have to go check in.
Yeah.
Take that flight. I'm going to Nicaragua.
Of course.
Soon to be another target.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Gloria. Gail,
travels.
why don't you get in here? I mean, certainly give us your thoughts about that clip and anything else. Oh, Gail, you might be muted.
Oh,
now we got you.
There you go. No, you're not. We got you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Just so you all made such, I think, really tremendously salient points that there's a history of that kind of rhetoric, of that kind of vicious, vile sort of approach when it comes to Cuba. You all mentioned the shooting down of planes, the fencing team that was, of young people that were just, wiped off the planet, the assassination, not only attempts, but successful assassinations. I mean, throughout the history of Cuba's revolutionary project, there have been all of these attacks. And so this is very much part and parcel with that kind of a mentality. But yeah, how is it that you think helping Cuba is going to be, achieved through bombing of the country? It's just it makes no sense. It's ludicrous, and I just want to reiterate that what was being said earlier by my sister Gloria is that many of us are working at collecting money so that we can send some much needed supplies, medical supplies to Cuba. This is not. I think it's really important to make sure that we say that this is not the solution to Cuba's problems. The solution is lifting the blockade. And that's something that the Trump administration that I'm sorry, slip of the tongue there. The Biden administration, or maybe not, could
Freudian
easily
slip.
do. Freudian slip. Could do and should do. But that's what really Cuba is in need of. But in the meanwhile, its friends in the international community, as Gloria was mentioning, the Answer Coalition, but certainly IFCO Pastors for Peace, we're in the process of raising funds so that we can get as much medical supplies on the ground to help those that are really suffering at this very moment, while we continue to push and speak out and act out against this draconian blockade policy. And appreciate having platforms like this to be able to talk about the reality on the ground in Cuba.
No, well, absolutely. And Gail, we really appreciate you being willing to join us, giving us this opportunity. We'll obviously continue to talk and tell people about the work that you all are doing at IFCO. And I'll say before you go, Elizabeth Marino just made a donation in the Super Chat with the note, "Long live Pastors for Peace and people-to-people foreign policy." So the fans and all of us here at Breakthrough News, really grateful to you for joining us.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all you're doing and the important information you're putting out, countering some of the mess that we hear on, certainly not just sort of mainstream media. I mean, I'm talking about the MSNBCs, the more quote unquote progressive, allegedly media outlets that are also helping to fan the flame. So it's important to have a platform for these our voices. We appreciate all you do.
Right on. Thank you so much.